Today we have the results from 4 days of monitoring, and those days the samples were taken on November 13th, 16th, 19th, and 23rd. We plan to continue to taking samples and monitor for 3 whole months in Willowbrook. And as you listen to the results today, it's important to keep in mind that these are preliminary data, and we do not consider them conclusive. As we said from the beginning, that it will take us time to gather the information we need to fully understand what's happening and to, as necessary, devise solutions. So we're still closer to the beginning of that process than the end of the process. Having said that, we know that you want answers. We know that you want action. We are regularly hearing from many of you by email and by telephone and other means of communication. As we said in the community meeting, we do care about this issue very deeply, and we're working very hard to gather the data that we think are necessary to, as I said before, fully understand what's going on and create the best scientific and legal foundation that we have to support the decisions that we'll have to make as to what to do about the situation. So this is a serious issue. We're taking it enormously seriously, and we're committed to continuing to work with the state, the folks at the company, and with you, everyone in the community, to address the ethylene oxide issue here. So thank you again for joining. I'll hand it back over to Laura McKelvey, and we'll continue with the program.
All right, thanks, Bill, and I will hand it off to Lou Weinstock, and he's going to talk about the monitoring.
Thank you, Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to take a few moments just to review the ambient sampling plan that EPA has put in place in the Willowbrook area. A lot of this information is posted on the public website, but I think it's important to go over it again, make sure we're all on the same page kind of going forward. The ambient sampling plan itself was developed to address a number of the issues that are described in our quality assurance project plan. Number one, to determine the maximum and long-term concentrations of ETO in proximity to the facility, exploring the relationship of the ambient concentrations of ETO to the actual facility operations, their vents and the fugitive emissions, and the amount of ETO they use in their daily operations, and also to characterize the concentrations in the potentially affected neighborhoods to the greatest extent possible, given the method sensitivity issues we'll talk about in a second. The plan itself, the sampling plan, had 8 locations. 2 of them were chosen as the maximum receptors or locations nearby to the facility as identified by dispersion modeling. So those 2 are in close proximity to the facility. There are 3 other locations in residential neighborhoods that are potentially affected based on the modeling that we did before we began the sampling plan. And also, many of you who helped us and on public phone calls helped us identify 3 additional locations in residential neighborhoods that you've selected as your own priorities and for which we have begun monitoring for. We actually conduct the ETO ambient sampling on a 1-in-3 schedule. Again, what that means is that a sample is placed out every 3rd day based on a nationally consistent sampling calendar. As Bill mentioned, we began sampling at the 2 maximum concentration sites, actually the Willowbrook Village Hall and the EPA warehouse, on November 13th. We again sampled there on November 16th, and then the full network, the remaining 6 sites, became operational on November 19th. Generally speaking, we follow the national calendar. There are just a few exceptions with holidays, things like that, so we move that around for logistical reasons, but we're not actually missing any samples. We're actually just moving the sampling up or back a day just to accommodate the federal holidays. Each actual sampling event begins around 10:00 local time in the morning, and it ends at 10:00 local time the next morning. So the sample duration for everyone is approximately 24 hours. The actual sampling period, again, Bill mentioned this, is 90 days. So currently we're about 1 month into this 90-day study. Now, one thing I think it's important to note, many of you may be monitoring that you may have heard about, or air quality forecast during the summer for your area, for instance, for ozone or particulate matter. Those are continuous measurements that occur all the time. The technology supports that. That's not the case, though, for very specialized analyses, and that's why for ethylene oxide, we use this particular method that exposes for 24 hours, and then the cans, of course, are shipped back to North Carolina for analysis. The method itself uses these evacuated stainless steel canisters. You may have seen pictures of them. You may have actually seen them deployed in your community that are provided by our contract lab. They're cleaned, sent out to your area, and then with our EPA Region 5 partners are deployed on sampling days and then picked up and shipped back to our lab for analysis. The cans themselves, the contents are analyzed specifically for ethylene oxide using a method called TO15. And for you techie types, it employs a process called gas chromatography and mass spectrometry. In addition to ETO, we also analyze the presence of trans-2-butene, which has been previously described and discussed as a potential interferent for ETO. The MDL, or the method detection limit for ETO in our analysis, is 0.082 micrograms per cubic meter, and for trans-2-butene, it's 0.0206, again, micrograms per cubic meter. In addition to these ETO measurements and trans-2-butene measurements, we're measuring weather data on the roof of the nearby EPA warehouse, and those data are really helpful to us to help understand the variation of the concentrations on any given sample day. Those data are also backed up by weather data that are being measured at the Argonne National Laboratory that have been made available to us. Although, many of you are aware that there's met data that's easily available from the Midway Airport, we're only really using those for historical purposes because for the analysis of these individual samples, it's always much better to use the closest met sites that you can get. Our contract lab provides the data and is posted publicly approximately 3 weeks after each sampling date. The time interval itself provides time for the shipping back and forth from the lab to your area, the exposure, the actual sampling period, and then we employ a rigorous quality assurance process that's described in our quality assurance project plan that is posted on our website. The data are posted on the public web after the QA process in 3 different ways. The results are either posted in micrograms per cubic meter for valid samples at or above the detection limit, which I mentioned previously, ND for valid samples below the detection limit, ND meaning non-detect, or invalid in the very rare cases when a sampling or a QA issue is noted. So that's the highlights of the sampling plan to date. And what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Mike Herber, who will talk about the data that we have measured and the path forward.
Great. Thank you, Lou. So what you're looking at right now is a map of the monitoring sites, and Lou's already described this for you. We have 2 close-in sites at the Village Hall and the Willowbrook warehouse location. Those are the yellow stars. Next to those stars, or close to those stars, are 2 boxes, purple boxes with an X to them. Those are the 2 Sterigenics buildings that we are focused on. Lou also mentioned some other nearby sites, the water tower site, the green dot to the north, the West neighborhood site, the green dot to the west, and Gower Middle School, the green dot to the southeast. Those are other nearby locations that our analyses indicated could be affected by emissions from the 2 Sterigenics buildings. And then he also mentioned the input that we got from local elected officials. So Gower Elementary School, the Blue Diamond to the west, Hinsdale South High School, the Blue Diamond to the northwest, and Willow Pond Park, the Blue Diamond to the north. Those are the additional 3 locations that we added to the network to provide additional coverage throughout the communities. So those are the 8 sites that we are collecting data. And what I'd like to do now is just take a couple minutes to walk through the results for the 4 sampling days, starting with November 13th. So again, you see the various symbols, but 2 things to note that we did not have on the previous map. First of all, we have results for 2 locations, the Village Hall and the Willowbrook warehouse site. The Village Hall sample was invalid due to a problem with the sampling canister. The Willowbrook warehouse site came back with a reading a little more than 2 micrograms per cubic meter for the 24-hour period. We did not collect samples at any of the other 6 sites on this initial day of sampling, just the 2 close-in sites. What you also see here in the upper right-hand corner is a windrose. So a windrose provides information on wind direction and wind speed. Each spoke of the windrose shows the direction from which the wind is coming, not the direction the wind is blowing, but the direction from which the wind is coming. So as you can see here on November 13th, the wind was generally out of the west. The colors, there's a color-coded scale in the lower right-hand corner of the windrose diagram. The colors represent the wind speeds. And you see a lot of blue, which corresponds to generally lighter winds on the order of 1 to 4 knots, which is about 1 to 5 miles per hour. So generally light winds out of the west on this particular day. And as Lou said earlier, having the local wind information in conjunction with the measurements allows us sort of a first cut at understanding sort of the transport patterns and source-receptor relationships on each of these days. So again, the results for November 13th, just 2 samples. 1 sample came back as invalid. The other one was about 2 micrograms per cubic meter. The second sampling day, November 16th, once again, we just had samples on 2 days, 2 close-in sites, Willowbrook Village Hall and the Willowbrook warehouse site. The Village Hall reading for the 24-hour period was a little less than 1 microgram per cubic meter. And the Willowbrook warehouse site came back a little less than 2 micrograms per cubic meter. And as you can see from the windrose, the predominant wind direction, the most frequent wind direction, was out of the west. Winds were a little more variable because you do see these spokes coming from several other directions, and you see a lot of blue, but you do see a stronger westerly component for many hours on this particular day. Our third day of sampling is November 19th. And as Lou mentioned, this is the first day that all 8 sites operated. So starting with the 2 close-in sites, the Willowbrook Village Hall and the Willowbrook warehouse site, both of those 24-hour readings came back on the order of 6 micrograms per cubic meter. At the surrounding 6 sites, the green dots as well as the blue diamonds, all of the readings came back for the 24-hour period as non-detects. That doesn't mean there was not ethylene oxide. It was just we were not able to measure accurately the concentration. They were below the detection level, 0.082 micrograms that Lou mentioned earlier. Looking at the windrose in the upper right-hand corner, you'll note that over the 24-hour period, we did have a wind shift. A wind started out of the southwest for part of the period and then shifted to out of the northwest for part of the period. So somewhat more variable wind direction on this day compared to the previous 2 days that we just looked at. And finally, for November 23rd, we adjusted, I should say, our 1 and 3 day sampling schedule because November 22nd was Thanksgiving Day. So the sampler was deployed on Friday, the 23rd, and ran for a 24-hour period. The readings for the 2 close-in sites, the Willowbrook Village Hall site came back lower than the previous readings that we had close in. It was only 0.28 micrograms per cubic meter. And the Willowbrook warehouse site came back as a non-detect. Again, the lab was not able to identify a concentration below detection level. If you look at the windrose, I think you'll begin to understand the transport pattern on this particular day. The windrose shows winds primarily out of the southeast, and you see some red on there indicating stronger winds, so a stronger southerly flow on this particular day. And what we see in the readings to the north, the water tower site came back a little less than 1 microgram per cubic meter. The Willow Pond Park site came back around 0.3 micrograms per cubic meter. 3 other sites came back as non-detect, and the Hinsdale South site was determined to be invalid due to a lab processing issue. So those are the results that we have to date. We just posted the November 23rd readings yesterday. As Lou indicated, we are going to continue on a 1 and 3 day sampling schedule for another couple months. We've been saying that it takes about 3 weeks from sample collection before we make data publicly available. So we do anticipate to get the next few days of data very soon, and should be able to post those as soon as next week. And then going forward, we're looking at about every other week posting additional days of measurements. So with that, I think we turn to questions.
I think you turn it back over to me.
All right.
What we're going to do, we're going to take just a couple minutes to go through the questions. And so hold on as we get ourselves organized here. So we have a question about where are the samples for November 16th and 17th?
Yeah, so what we've posted is everything that we've collected. Again, on this particular day, only the 2 close-in sites, the Willowbrook Village Hall and the Willowbrook Warehouse site, were collecting data. None of the other sites were collecting data yet.
So we got a question about whether or not Sterigenics will shut down for the holidays, and are we accounting for that in the monitoring?
We don't know what their operating schedule is going to be over the coming holidays. We have been in contact with them about trying to get information about their operations. We don't have that yet. We will continue to sample on about a 1 and 3 day schedule.
Okay. And another question about the monitoring. Does Sterigenics know which days you're sampling?
Yes, they do. As Lou said earlier, it's the national schedule for 1 and 3 day sampling. And that was pretty clear in our quality and our monitoring plan that we posted. We have 8 monitoring sites. Oh, the question is, how many sites are we operating in total? We currently are operating 8 sites.
Okay. So we're a month into the sampling. Why are there so few results?
Yeah, as I said earlier, it takes, and Lou mentioned this as well, it takes about 3 weeks for us to go through the full process. We've noted for some time that there are limitations with the monitoring method. For this particular chemical, we have to collect a canister in the field that then gets shipped back to the laboratory. They need to do their analysis. They need to do quality assurance of that. And then we need to do a follow-up QA review in our shop here. It is taking us on the average of about 21 to 24 days to actually post results from when they're collected in the field to the time you see them on the website. I expect that time period to probably continue going forward. We wish it could be faster, but again, it's one of the limitations of measuring for this chemical.
And the next question is, since you've released a report on trans-2-butene prior to Thanksgiving and no trans-2-butene has been detected, will you put in writing that you stand by your previous tests?
This is Lou Weinstock. The sampling that we're doing now that uses the modified TO15 method, again, we're very confident of the fact that trans-2-butene is not an interferent, and again, our results show that it's not detect. I think we've acknowledged previously that other sampling that may have been done either by our lab or other labs for ethylene oxide, there is this uncertainty about whether or not the presence of trans-2-butene is important or not. Without having those data before us, unfortunately, there's no way for
risk below the detection limit. What do you propose to do about that glaring hole in restoring public confidence that this testing is relevant?
This is Mike again. We've been saying for a while that our goal here is to do a more refined risk assessment for this area, and the ambient monitoring will help inform that. We talked at the public meeting about trying to better understand emissions. There was a stack test performed, as you all know, at the company back in mid-September. That helps us quantify part of the emissions, but we need to understand total emissions. And in particular, we need to understand what's coming out through various leaks and vents at the building, the so-called fugitive emissions. Once we have a better handle on the fugitive emissions, then we can use an air quality model to do the more refined risk assessment. The ambient monitoring and perhaps other data that gets collected over the next couple of months will definitely help us understand fugitives better and will better inform our risk assessment.
All right, the next question is why no monitors line up with the data?
So the National Air Toxics Assessment, as we've explained previously, is a screening analysis that tells us where to look closer. And part of that closer look here is with the ambient monitoring, and it is also the more refined risk assessment that I just mentioned a minute ago. So in terms of monitoring matching up with data was what pointed us at this area. Now the more refined information, the monitoring, and the air quality modeling going into the risk assessment is going to help us better characterize risk in this community.
Okay, so the next question is, do you really need the data when you're already measuring results that are at 6.21 and 6.62?
So Bill noted this in his opening remarks that the information we have to date is very preliminary. We only have a few data points. It's not enough to draw any conclusions from the information we have. Yes, we do have two 24-hour samples close in on one day that are on the order of 6 micrograms. But at those two locations, on other days, we have lower readings. So we really need to understand the day-to-day variability. Maybe it's operations related, maybe it's meteorology related, but having a single 24-hour measurement is not a sufficient basis for us to take action.
Oh, sorry, I was talking on mute. How are you utilizing the Burr Ridge and Willowbrook air testing?
First of all, I want to thank Willowbrook and Burr Ridge for using their own money to conduct supplemental sampling on two of our sampling days, on November 13th and November 16th. We have limitations in the spatial coverage of our network. You've already noted that in some of your questions. The additional measurements help us fill in some of the spatial gaps on those days in particular. And we did actually have one co-located sample collected by the Village of Willowbrook at the Village Hall site. So having those supplemental measurements gives us a better spatial picture of what's happening, and we're currently in communication with both villages and their contractor on our laboratory methods to make sure they are comparable. But certainly having those co-located measurements, I think we'll understand how the two different data sets, the EPA data sets and the Burr Ridge and Willowbrook data sets, fit together.
The wind roses that you showed today were helpful in interpreting the results, and today was the first time I saw them. Will you release the wind roses alongside the data in the upcoming data releases?
Yeah, so we are going to be providing the slides, so you'll be able to see these particular wind roses. We agree that they are very helpful in trying to understand the data. Again, it's just a few data points, not enough here to draw any conclusions, but I think they are helpful. So certainly these slides, we will provide the information. We do have local meteorology, as Lou mentioned earlier. That really helps us understand what the patterns are, what the wind patterns are in this immediate area on our sampling day. So we'll continue to try to make that information available.
So the next question is, why were there so few monitors? Why were only 8 monitors selected?
So this is Lou Weinstock. We have a lot of confidence that the monitors out there are sufficient to characterize the emissions from Sterigenics. As Mike mentioned, on any given day, the wind may blow in a particular direction that we may not have a monitor on that day. But I think you also see from the wind roses, it's very rare that the wind is just from one direction. In fact, on a number of the sampling days, the wind actually shifted during the day and overnight period. So I think that the dispersal of monitors that we have is specific. Now, the actual locations that EPA shows, the close-in sites as well as the green dots, were based on the dispersion modeling we actually did. So we targeted the areas that both the stack testing information and the modeling showed to be impacted areas. So we focused on those. If there was an issue about the highway, of course, due east of the facility, you have, I believe, I-55 going through. That's not necessarily a suitable place to put a monitor. So I would say, of course, it's very early, as Mike has mentioned, but I think the results we've seen so far and the way that they've matched up to the wind roses indicates that we have adequate coverage, and I think we're confident going forward that whatever the wind direction on a particular day, that we will have things covered to the best extent that we can.
And I'll just add, we said before that there are limitations with monitoring for this chemical because of detection levels and some other concerns. So there's only so much we can do with the monitoring data. And as I also just said, our goal here is to do a modeling-based risk assessment, and we're going to use this information to help inform that modeling-based risk assessment. The modeling will look at locations throughout the area. So the coverage of the air quality model will certainly be more complete spatially than what you see here with our ambient monitoring network.
Okay, so we've got a theme of a number of questions about ethylene oxide, ethylene bags. Gosh, I can't even talk. Consumption. So sampling results without known ETO consumption of styrogenics would seem to present a problem making fair comparison. What steps are being taken to ensure that styrogenics was and is operating in a normal fashion? And I think, Bill, you were going to, or Mike?
Yeah, this is Mike. I'll take that one. We agree that having information on usage will be helpful helpful, and we have verbally and in writing requested that information with Sterigenics, and we're in conversation with them about how to best receive that information. So we are working to collect that. We do not have that yet, but we are working to get that information.
All right, so another theme that we're hitting on the questions is why don't you shut down Sterigenics and test the air to see if ethylene oxide levels decrease? And Bill, I think that one was to you.
Right. And frankly, the way that question usually comes to us is why don't you shut down the facility, not for experimental purposes, but to protect public health in the community. And we talked a bit about this during the community meeting a couple weeks ago. And I think a theme you've heard from us today is we are gathering information that helps us characterize what's going on. And, you know, we're still closer to the beginning of that process than the end of that process. But our goal in gathering that information is to allow us to make informed decisions about further legal or regulatory action. We have a variety of tools in that toolbox, from national regulations to very site-specific things like a requirement to install additional emissions controls or reduce emissions, possibly up to and including shutdown. But before we use any of those legal mechanisms, we have to make sure that we have an absolutely solid factual basis to back up what it is we order them to do as a matter of law and regulation. So we're making great strides in that direction. We're learning more every day about what's going on through the ambient monitoring, but through other information collection activities that we're undertaking. And our goal is very quickly to be at a place where we as fully understand what's going on as we possibly can, and then once we're at that point, we'll have the facts and the information necessary to make the right regulatory or legal decision. So that's our goal. That's where we're going.
Okay, there's a question about, we've had many meetings with Sterigenics, and what have you talked to them about, and what have you learned?
This is Mike. There are really two main topics that we've had conversations with them about, both pretty technical issues. One, laboratory procedures. They all collected some data back in October, I believe, and issued a press release with that information. We've been trying to better understand their procedures, their laboratory process, to see if that's also information that we can combine with some of our measurements to better understand ethylene oxide levels throughout the Chicago area. So one set of meetings and discussions have been related to air monitoring. Another topic of conversation has been fugitives and trying to see what approach we can take to better quantify fugitive emissions. We talked at the public meeting about an assumed emission factor that the company has used. We need to get information to better understand whether that emission factor should be adjusted. So talking about how we would use the monitoring, talking about perhaps other data that could be collected to determine an appropriate emission factor for fugitives, that's been the second topic that we've had conversations with them about.
And Mike, this is Bill. I'm going to jump in and add to that because we have had several conversations with the company. We're regularly in communication with the company, and in addition to the information gathering that Mike described, we're also talking to the company about, their interaction with the community and the steps that they're taking to address the situation from their perspective. It's troubling to me, and I think troubling to us at EPA, that they're not able to effectively communicate with you and interact with you in a way that gives you trust and confidence. And if we can get them to that place, I believe that's very important, because it would be a much better situation if you had a trust relationship and a confident relationship rather than the current distrustful relationship that exists. So we're working on that front and hope to be successful, and hope that one day they will be able to participate in these discussions and sit at the table with us and help help us get to where we need to be.
Okay, so we got a question. We noticed that Sterigenics is not reporting emissions to TRI. Well, what emissions data are used in the modeling?
So the information that we've done modeling with includes the stack tests that they collected in September and assumptions being made on fugitives. So that was the information when Lou mentioned we did modeling health site monitors. That was the more recent information that we use in terms of emission inputs.
And there was another question about Sterigenics not submitting data into TRI and getting information about why that is.
Yeah, that's a good question. That toxic release inventory TRI program is handled out of another office in EPA. It is an Office of Air and Radiation. So we need to talk with them to figure out what is the process and procedures for companies to report data.
And another theme of the questions have been around indoor testing. Are there plans for doing any indoor testing in the future?
As Lou described our monitoring program earlier, our focus is on outdoor air. That's where we have authority under the Clean Air Act to take action. We are aware that Village of Willowbrook did do indoor air testing, and I think you've all seen the results of that. We are consulting with our indoor air office at EPA about those results, and we'll try to include them in future conversations going forward.
All right. Another theme is on background concentrations, and one representative question is Willowbrook and Burr Ridge data seem to indicate there is substantial background concentrations of EPO. Is EPA conducting any investigations on background concentrations more globally than just Willowbrook?
So the focus of our monitoring here, of course, is on the immediate Willowbrook area, and we will have monitors cited, quote-unquote, upwind on certain days, and we can look at some of those upwind readings to see what they might say about background. Generally, the sites away from the two close-in sites, so the surrounding 6 community sites, have mostly come back as non-detect on 2 days. So just 2 days of measurements there. We will need to look at additional days to see what they might say about characterizing background in this particular area. Of course, there are measurements available in other places. The work that Sterigenics did back in September. I mentioned we're trying to understand that to see how that could inform our understanding of background. And there are other measurements being collected around the country. In Colorado, for example, they collected some information. We're looking at that to see what that might tell us in terms of what background levels might be in other places of the United States.
So there's a theme of questions around the frequency of monitoring how often the schedule is posted and where it's posted. So I'm going to summarize all of those by asking Lou to talk a little bit more about the CLAP and the schedule for monitoring.
Sure. The actual sampling schedule that we've talked about a number of times now is posted in the Quality Assurance Project Plan. That's a link off the public ETO website. As we've acknowledged, there were a couple of changes to the plan because of holidays and other things. So we'll work with our web folks to make sure that the revised sampling calendar is easily available. So that's something we'll take as a to-do on our end.
the end of the call, are there follow-up issues that we can do to understand diesel?
Our current understanding is that mobile sources, trucks and cars, are not big emitters of ethylene oxide, but that is an area of research, and we will be collecting information here that might shed some light on that.
So we got a theme of questions again around understanding the concentrations of ethylene oxide below the minimum detect level. How can we better understand that, or are there ways that we will measure that?
Yeah, unfortunately, with the current methodologies, we just don't know below 0.082 micrograms per cubic meter what the actual ethylene oxide concentrations are using monitoring. That's why air quality modeling will be very important here, because we can model much lower levels with the air quality model, assuming we have a good emissions inventory.
So, guys, we were just trying to get some more themes, and we're running out of time. So I'm going to do some wrap-up here. First of all, thank you guys for participating in the call. We are going to capture these questions, and we'll be working through them. I had a question earlier today about the questions from our in-person meeting. We are hoping to post some stuff in even maybe today or tomorrow. That will start to give you answers to the questions from the earlier meeting. And so the last thing I wanted to do, I wanted to get feedback from y'all about this format. Is this useful? We had some thoughts about additional conversations with you about our regulatory authority and the processes that we use and how we write our rules, and then maybe a webinar on how to participate in the rule development process and how to prepare effective comments. I know when we were in the in-person meeting, that came up a couple times in our conversations, and then check back again with the monitoring. So I would ask you guys to email me your thoughts on that. My email is McKelvey, McKelvey.Laura, LAURA, @EPA.gov. Go ahead and feel free to contact me if you have other questions. And I really would like feedback on this format for continuing our conversations. With that, I'm going to thank everybody for calling in, and thank Mike and Lou and Bill Wareham for participating in the webinar and all of your time. Thank you guys for everything.